chapters 8 through to 10, as we've seen, are a long argument about this whole participation in idol worship. But I'm going to take a section out of it again and just comment on it this morning. So let me pray. Father, thank you for the warmth of being together. Thank you for another beautiful day. Thanks for the rain that you've sent last night. Thank you for the reminder that you supply all our needs. We thank you for the revelation of Jesus. We thank you for the collection of his teachings in the New Testament. And as we reflect on this morning, give us insight and that desire to hear your voice and follow. Amen. This is a photo of one of my former, more fetching outfits from my former days. I don't know if you can quite make that out, but I'm the guy in the middle. It was the wedding of dear friends of ours, Lindy's and mine, at a beautiful college chapel in Perth. Now, I hope it's not too shocking to see me dressed up in a dress like that. Who grew up in a church where the guy up the front dressed like that? Anybody? Or maybe school chapel looked a bit like that. Who definitely didn't grow up in a church that looked like that? Yeah, we come from very different church experiences, don't we? For many people, let me be really frank, that is weird. My best mate after I became a Christian was the son of a Baptist minister, and they sort of don't wear gear like that. He came to visit me in Sydney one year, him and his wife, and just for a joke, I put all this gear on just before I walked in the front door of my own house, and they were waiting there to give the impression that I wear this every single day, and he was a bit shocked by it. For many people, that is just weird, but for a lot of other people, that's actually what genuine religious leaders look like. You know, as you know, growing up, every Sunday morning, my family went to the football, or we played football, or we went to the beach. So the idea of getting dressed up in a robe like that was the absolute furthest thing from my mind. For me, with my upbringing, that was borderline weird. And then being converted in a low church context, as they say, the preacher in jeans and a t-shirt, what happened? How did I end up like that? That's what my mates always ask. Well, these verses that we read last week in 1 Corinthians 9 shape my thinking profoundly. Paul says, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law. Though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not under the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. They are profound words about how we are to do ministry, how we are to do life. If someone's cultural experience is the religious authority wears a robe, give me a robe. If a robe is weird and a strange cultural thing, get rid of the robe. Be all things to all people. Chameleon-like, changeable, flexible, to remove barriers, to open up engagement on the things that ultimately don't really matter, but are just preferences. But uncompromising, unchanging on the message. This sort of flexibility is illustrated by a seeming contradiction in the New Testament. Paul makes clear that the demand from some quarters that Gentiles who convert must also be circumcised as well as believe in Jesus to be saved is heretical. Paul says no. So Galatians 5. Let me read out these words from Galatians 5, verse 1. In regard to this issue of circumcision, Paul says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace." So he's saying, if you're someone that thinks that some religious ritual will make God pleased with you, it means you're not relying on Christ. It's not about some ritual, not even circumcision. So, and yet, and at the end of it, Paul is so adamant on this, he even says at the end of verse 12, of these people who are trying to push circumcision, I turn the page, back to Galatians 5, verse 12. He says, "As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves." Cut the whole thing off, not just the tip. And then, in Acts chapter 16, this is where it seems contradictory. Paul comes across Timothy. His mother's Greek. His mother's Jewish. His grandmother's Jewish. His father's Greek. It says Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on his journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So here's the Apostle Paul getting Timothy circumcised, and in another context, Paul's saying, don't you dare get circumcised because then you stop relying on Christ for your salvation. And Timothy's probably about age 35 at this point. Why? Well, so that Timothy would be culturally acceptable to the Jews that he was trying to reach with the gospel. It is a classic embodiment of trying to be all things to all people. So the very same action, circumcision, in one context is absolutely wrong, and in another context, absolutely right. As a requirement for salvation, never. As a means of cultural connection, yes. How flexible are you prepared to be so that people might hear the message? Now, we're not calling for circumcision these days to be culturally appropriate, but in an Australian context, culturally, what do you think are the important things? Well, let's be frank, there's a whole lot of different cultures, aren't there? But one that is obvious to me, to my mind, is alcohol. I think culturally, to not drink alcohol in Australia is odd. And if you wear dresses and you don't wear alcohol, you are absolutely beyond the pale. Now, there are very good reasons that some people don't drink alcohol. They have a destructive addiction. And everybody respects that. Church person or non-church person admires that resolve, that understands that sacrifice. But a church that campaigns for abstinence completely disengages culturally. And that has been the history of churches, hasn't it? I think it was a profound mistake. So for people who've been raised in a religious context where culturally the bloke up the front wears a robe or wears a collar, you've got to put on the robe and put on the collar. but make sure the message is clear. As messengers of the gospel, we are to bend and twist and give up our preferences, give up our cultural niceties, our favourite ways of doing things, so that other people might hear the gospel. So verse 19 of chapter 9, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jew. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. Paul literally participates in Jewish festivals and Jewish rituals. He doesn't eat pork around the Jews to win those who are shaped and live by the Old Testament law. Now, all the time knowing the law has been fulfilled, it has been ended in Jesus. But Paul participates and bends himself so that he might win the Jews. Verse 21, to those not having the law, talking about Gentiles here, I became like one not having the law. And though he qualifies, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. It's certainly not a free-for-all, but it's maximum flexibility about how you live, what you eat, and what you drink, and how you worship. So with the Gentiles, he tucks into the ham sandwich. Doesn't bat an eyelid. But he makes clear, as we said, that he isn't free from Christ's law, that abiding morality that binds all followers of Jesus. But he's flexible. Then in verse 22, to the weak, I become weak to win the weak. As Jeff explained a couple of Sundays ago, the weak here in Paul's passage are Christians who have a oversensitivity, a sensitive conscience, and so they want rules in place to make sure they don't get close to sinning. They were concerned about food that was bought from the pagan temple, that eating it was somehow sinful. And Paul just says, it's just food. It doesn't matter where it came from. Yes, you can eat the meal. You can even go to the temple restaurant if you're invited and have a meal. But if it's going to cause your Christian brother or sister to think that they can worship at the idol temple and mix idol worship and Jesus worship, then don't go near that meat. Don't go near that restaurant. It's all about context. It's all about not giving a confusing message in regard to other religions. Yes, you can eat the meat, and it's just meat. But if you're giving fellow Christians and Jews and pagans the idea that they can worship idols and the true God, then don't go near it. And so it's nuanced, isn't it? We are to bend and twist and limit our freedoms, limit our rights, do things culturally that we may not prefer, so that other people might be saved. How we do church should be informed by making it accessible to outsiders. The language we use, Paul will stress later in this letter, using intelligible words in church is much better than speaking in tongues in church, so that people can actually understand what's going on. Some of the theological language and Christian cliches we use are frankly bewildering to lots of people. You know, meeting Jesus. What does that mean? It could mean a whole lot of different things, can't it? Hearing Jesus, knowing Jesus. These are all good ideas, but what does it mean to outsiders? What do they make of it? To be honest, bewildering. Now, if we had the resources here, I would love to run 5 different style churches. Very traditional, hang from the ceilings, everything in between, because it will culturally engage different people. But the principle is, we are to be all things to all people so that they might be saved. We are the ones who are to bend, not the outsiders. And so what that means is church and how we might want it done, our right to have church the way that we want it to be done, shouldn't always be our number one concern, should it? But to do church in a way that will help outsiders get the message. Paul finishes this long section of 8, 9 and 10 with this phrase. He says, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way. For I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved." And then he says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." Christ gave up his glory, gave up his power, humbled himself as a man, took on the cross. I think I can put on a dress. How can you be flexible? How can you give up your rights, your preferences, to make sure the message is heard? We live in a day and an era where church is often shaped as if we're consumers. And I want to go to a church where I get what I want. It's the complete opposite of the apostolic tradition, isn't it? We do church for the good of others. Let me pray. Father, thank you for this example of flexibility, bendability to see the gospel go out. Please help us to know what that means as we navigate life with our neighbours, with our workmates, with our families, that we may not get in the way of the message, but we might live and proclaim Christ with graciousness, gentleness, and in a compelling way for your glory. Amen.